My son set the table for Thanksgiving himself this year. 11 plates, 11 sets of silverware, careful as a soldier, because he'd counted heads twice to make sure nobody would be forgotten. He forgot to count himself. Nobody told him to. He just assumed, the way kids do when they've been quietly taught not to expect a seat, that the 12th chair wasn't his to claim. What my father-in-law did when he noticed that empty chair is the reason our family doesn't look anything like it used to. Stay with me, because this one ends somewhere you won't see coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones finally get the last word. If you've ever watched a child shrink himself to take up less space in a room that should have belonged to him too, this story is for you. Tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe so the next one finds you. My name is Renee. I'm 39, I run a small bakery outside Asheville, and 6 years ago I married a widower named Marcus with a son from his first marriage, Caleb, who was 7 when we met and is 13 now. Caleb's mother died of an aneurysm in a grocery store parking lot when he was 4. One minute she was loading bags into the car, the next she was gone, and Caleb has exactly one clear memory of her, the smell of her shampoo, and he's terrified every year that it's fading. Marcus's family, the Vances, are old money trying very hard to look like new money, a winery, a lake house, a family foundation with Marcus's late mother's name on it. And at the center of all of it sits Eleanor Vance, Marcus's grandmother, 91 years old, sharp as a blade, and the kind of woman who believes a family is a contract you're either born into or you're not. I want to be clear about something before I go further. Eleanor was never cruel to me. She was almost warm to me, actually, complimented my baking, asked about the shop, remembered my birthday. It took me 3 years to understand that her warmth toward me was strategic. I was Marcus's wife. I counted. Caleb, who carried no Vance blood and wasn't even her actual great-grandson by birth, was a different category entirely. A guest who'd overstayed. It showed up in small things first. The family photo on her mantle, updated every Christmas, somehow never included Caleb, even in years he'd been right there in the room when it was taken. The college fund she'd set up for the grandchildren, funded for Marcus's 2 cousins' kids, never mentioned for Caleb. The way she introduced him at gatherings, and this is Marcus's boy, never my great-grandson, never just Caleb. I brought it up to Marcus once, gently, in our first year of marriage, and he got defensive in the way people do when they're not ready to see something about someone they love. She's old-fashioned, he said. She just needs time. I let it go because I needed to believe that too. But here's the thing about waiting for an old woman to come around. You don't notice you've spent 6 years doing it until a 13-year-old boy sets a table for 11 people instead of 12 and doesn't even think to question it. 3 weeks before that Thanksgiving, I was helping Marcus's mother, Diane, clean out Eleanor's study for an estate planning meeting. Eleanor had finally agreed at 91 to formalize her will, and in a drawer I wasn't supposed to be in, looking for a stapler, I found a draft. Not the final document. A draft, with Eleanor's handwritten notes in the margins. It listed the foundation's beneficiaries. Marcus's cousins' 4 children, named individually, each with a designated trust amount. Marcus's name as Eleanor's only living grandson. And then, beneath all of it, one line that stopped my hand cold. Caleb, not blood. Discuss with Marcus separately. Possible smaller gift. Discretionary, not trust. Not blood. Discretionary. A boy who'd called her Great-Grandma Ellie since he could talk, reduced to a line item marked Discuss Separately, like a liability that needed managing before it could be folded into the family's actual future. I didn't say anything to Diane. I folded the page back exactly as I'd found it, and I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel, because I finally understood what I'd been excusing for 6 years wasn't old-fashioned confusion. It was a decision, made in pen, revisited and refined. That night, after Caleb was asleep, I told Marcus everything, the draft, the margin notes, the phrase that wouldn't leave my head. I watched my husband's face do something I'd never seen it do, not anger, exactly, grief. The specific grief of realizing the woman who raised you has a smaller heart than you spent your whole life believing she did. She's planning his exclusion like a project, he said quietly. Discuss separately, like he's a contract clause. I told him what I'd been afraid to say outright for years. Marcus, your grandmother isn't going to change. We've been waiting for a moment that was never coming. He didn't answer right away. He sat at our kitchen table with his head in his hands for a long time, and then he said the sentence that changed everything that happened after. Then I'm not going to ask her to change. I'm going to make it so it doesn't matter whether she does. I asked him what that meant. He looked up at me, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen since the early days, before grief had worn him soft and tired. Something like resolve. I'm going to legally make him a Vance, he said. Not because Eleanor needs to accept it, because Caleb needs to know it's true whether she does or not. Here's where it got complicated, and where you need to understand something most people don't know about blended families. Marcus was already Caleb's biological father. There was no adoption needed. Caleb was already, legally, fully a Vance by birth. The exclusion wasn't a paperwork problem. It was a belief problem, sitting entirely in one 91-year-old woman's head and the foundation she controlled. So Marcus did something braver and harder than paperwork. He requested a meeting with Eleanor's estate attorney, not to fight her, not yet, but to understand exactly what power he had as her only grandson and likely successor trustee of the family foundation once she passed. And what the attorney told him changed the entire shape of our plan. Marcus wasn't just a beneficiary. Per the original foundation bylaws his own father had drafted decades ago, Marcus held something called successor designation rights, meaning that upon Eleanor's death or incapacitation, Marcus would become sole trustee, with full authority to redraw the beneficiary structure, regardless of what Eleanor's current will said. Eleanor's exclusion of Caleb wasn't permanent. It was temporary, and it only had power as long as everyone stayed quiet and let it stand unchallenged. Marcus didn't want to wait for his grandmother to die to fix this. He wanted to do something now, while Caleb was 13 and still young enough for it to actually heal something instead of just correcting a ledger after the fact. So he asked Eleanor directly for a family meeting, framed innocently as wanting to talk about the foundation's future since you're updating the will. Eleanor agreed, flattered, assuming Marcus wanted her guidance. We scheduled it for the week after Thanksgiving, which meant Thanksgiving itself, 11 plates set by a careful, hopeful 13-year-old boy who didn't think to count himself, was going to happen first, with all of this sitting unspoken underneath it. I want to pause here because I know some of you are holding your breath the way I was. If you've ever watched someone you love quietly shrink themselves to take up less space because some adult taught them they didn't fully belong, tell me in the comments. Tell me who taught you that you mattered less, and tell me if anyone ever stood up and proved them wrong. I read every single one of these. Thanksgiving at the Vance Lake House was, as always, a production, white tablecloths, the good china, candles Diane had been collecting since her own wedding. Caleb had spent the entire morning setting the table, humming to himself, folding napkins into little triangles he'd learned from a video, genuinely happy in the way only a kid who hasn't yet learned to expect disappointment can be. I watched him count the chairs as he set them, one for Eleanor, one for Diane, one for Marcus's cousins and their spouses and kids, one for me, one for Marcus. He stopped at 11. He looked at the table for a second, this quiet little furrow appearing between his eyebrows, and then, and this is the part that still makes my chest hurt to remember, he just nodded to himself like the math made sense, and went to get one more glass for the water pitcher instead of one more chair. He hadn't even registered that he belonged in the count. 6 years of small, polite exclusions had trained him to leave himself off the list before anyone else had the chance to. I saw Marcus watching from the kitchen doorway. I saw his jaw tighten, and I saw him walk over, without a word, pick up a 12th chair from the stack against the wall, and set it down at the table himself, right between his own seat and Eleanor's. He didn't make a speech. He just set it there and looked at Caleb and said, "You're sitting next to me, bud." Caleb looked at the chair like it might be a mistake. "There wasn't a spot," he said. "I counted." "You counted wrong," Marcus said, gentle as anything. "There's always a spot. There was always supposed to be a spot." It was such a small moment. Nobody but me even noticed it happen. But I watched my husband correct, with one folding chair, 6 years of a thing I'd let slide because I told myself it wasn't my place to push. The family meeting happened the following Tuesday, in Eleanor's study, the same study where I'd found the draft. Marcus brought the attorney. He brought me. And deliberately, he brought Caleb, sitting quietly in the corner with a book, present but not the center of attention. Present specifically so that whatever happened next, Caleb would know he'd been there for it. Eleanor began the way she always did, gracious and composed, talking about legacy and stewardship and the importance of keeping the family's foundation in the right hands. And then Marcus, calm as I'd ever seen him, opened a folder and laid the draft will on the table between them. The one with her handwriting in the margin. "I found this," he said, or Renee did. "Discuss with Marcus separately. Possible smaller gift, discretionary, not trust." Eleanor's composure flickered. Just slightly, the way ice cracks before it breaks all the way through. "That was a draft," she said carefully. "Nothing was finalized." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm not here to fight you about money, Grandma. I'm here to tell you something you need to understand before this gets finalized at all." He paused, and I watched him glance once at Caleb in the corner, then back at her. "Per Dad's original bylaws, I become sole trustee of the foundation when you're no longer able to serve. That's not a threat. That's just the structure you and Dad built, which means whatever you write into that will, I'm the one who actually administers it after you're gone." Eleanor's face went very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you, and I've spent 6 years waiting for you to decide on your own that Caleb counts the same as anyone else with our last name. And I'm done waiting. So I'm telling you now, formally, in front of a lawyer, when the time comes, I will restructure the trust so my son is included exactly as he should have been from the start. You can write whatever you want into your will today. It won't matter in the end. I'd just rather you choose it now while you're still the one giving it instead of having it corrected for you later." For a long moment, nobody spoke. And then Eleanor did something I never expected from a woman who had spent 91 years rarely admitting she was wrong about anything. She looked over at Caleb, sitting quietly in the corner with his book closed now, watching everything with the same careful, guarded eyes he'd worn at the dinner table when he miscounted the chairs. "Come here," she said to him. Not unkindly, just quietly. Caleb looked at his father first, checking, the way kids do when they've learned good things sometimes get taken back, and Marcus nodded, and Caleb walked over and stood in front of his great-grandmother. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, her old fingers closing around his, and she said, in a voice that cracked in a way I genuinely never heard from her, "I have spent a very long time being afraid that loving you the way I love the others meant I was betraying people who are already gone. That's not your fault. That was never your fault. It was mine, and it was foolish, and I am sorry it took my own grandson threatening to overrule me to say it." Caleb didn't say anything. He just nodded, the way he does when something is too big to answer with words. And then Eleanor said the thing that undid the whole room. "You count. You've always counted. I was simply too stubborn and too old in my thinking to say it where you could hear it." She rewrote the will herself the following week, with her attorney present, no longer needing Marcus's leverage to do it. Caleb's name went into the trust, not as a discretionary gift, not as a footnote, but exactly where his cousins' names were, in the same ink, with the same weight. This past Christmas, Eleanor's mantle photo included Caleb for the first time in 6 years, front and center actually, since Eleanor insisted on it herself, fussing over the arrangement until the photographer got it exactly the way she wanted. And at this year's Thanksgiving, Caleb set the table again. I watched him count the chairs from the kitchen doorway, the same careful counting ritual as always. This time he counted 12 and didn't stop and didn't hesitate, and didn't quietly leave himself off the list. He set his own plate down right next to his father's, like it had never once been a question. Family was never about who shares your blood. It's about who finally sits you down and tells you out loud that the chair was always yours. If this got you, tell me below who finally counted you in when it mattered. And if you're the one still waiting for someone to pull up that chair, I hope this is the sign you needed. Subscribe to Calm Drama Stories, because every empty chair deserves to be filled on purpose. Your story might be next.